There's a question almost every survivor of a narcissistic relationship eventually asks themselves, usually in a quiet, private moment, often with real frustration directed inward rather than outward. I understand the patterns now. I can explain intermittent reinforcement, I can recognize love bombing, I can spot the manufactured vulnerability the moment it appears. So why, knowing everything I now know, do I still feel this pull? Why haven't I already fully permanently left? This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it honestly because this question deserves an answer considerably more precise than "it's complicated" or "these things take time," true as both of those statements are. What we're actually examining is a specific set of internal mechanisms, distinct from anything the narcissist is doing, that keep people genuinely stuck, sometimes for years beyond the point where intellectual understanding alone would suggest leaving should already have happened. Understanding these mechanisms precisely, rather than simply feeling vague shame about still being stuck despite knowing better, is what actually makes movement possible. Let's start with the first and perhaps most misunderstood mechanism, because it directly contradicts something almost everyone assumes about why people stay. The belief that understanding a pattern intellectually is the same thing as being free from its pull emotionally. This assumption feels reasonable because knowledge generally does help in most areas of life. But remember something worth understanding as genuinely important throughout this entire series. The mechanisms that keep you attached to a narcissist operate primarily at the level of nervous system conditioning, not conscious belief. Intermittent reinforcement, the specific rhythm of unpredictable reward following unpredictable deprivation, conditions attachment at a level considerably deeper than rational thought. The same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive regardless of how clearly a gambler understands the mathematics working against them. This is worth understanding precisely, because it explains something that produces enormous, unnecessary shame in so many survivors. Knowing exactly how the pattern works and still feeling its pull isn't a contradiction, and it isn't evidence of some personal failing or unusual weakness. It's simply how conditioning actually functions in the human nervous system, considerably more resistant to conscious override than most people expect going in. You can know with complete intellectual clarity that a specific slot machine is rigged against you and still feel the pull to keep playing, because the conditioning operates on a level your conscious understanding, however accurate, simply doesn't have direct access to override. Let's talk about the second mechanism, one that connects to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series, but deserves specific attention here. The genuine physiological withdrawal that occurs when leaving a relationship characterized by this kind of intermittent reward. This is worth understanding as considerably more literal than most people expect, because the same neurochemical systems involved in substance addiction, dopamine in particular, tend to be genuinely activated by unpredictable reward, and disrupting that pattern through leaving or through genuine no contact produces something that closely resembles actual withdrawal, restlessness, intrusive thoughts, a persistent, physically uncomfortable pull toward reestablishing the pattern that's just been interrupted. Here's why this matters so much for understanding why you stay stuck. If leaving genuinely produces something resembling physiological withdrawal, then staying or repeatedly returning after attempted departures isn't simply a failure of willpower or resolve. It's a predictable, physiologically grounded response to disrupting a pattern your nervous system has become genuinely conditioned to expect and, in a real sense, to need. This doesn't mean withdrawal is permanent or that it can't be moved through successfully. It means the difficulty of staying away deserves to be understood accurately as a genuine physiological process requiring genuine time and genuine strategy to move through, rather than simply willed away through better understanding or stronger resolve alone. Let's talk about a third mechanism, one that operates through a considerably different pathway than the first two: identity entanglement, the genuine, often unconscious merging of your own sense of self with the relationship itself, to the point where imagining life without it doesn't simply mean imagining life without a person, but imagining life without a considerable portion of how you currently understand who you are. This is worth understanding as particularly powerful in relationships that have lasted considerable time, where your daily routines, your social identity, your sense of purpose, and even your understanding of your own capacity for love and patience have all become genuinely woven into the specific context of this relationship. Here's what's worth understanding about why this entanglement makes leaving feel considerably more threatening than simply losing a partner. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how identity and meaning represent one of the deepest, slowest areas to heal, precisely because they involve something considerably more fundamental than any single relationship. If a significant portion of your identity has become entangled with this specific relationship, leaving doesn't just mean losing them. It means, at least temporarily, losing access to a coherent sense of who you are. A genuinely disorienting experience that most people, understandably, work hard to avoid, even when remaining in the relationship itself continues causing real, ongoing harm. What we haven't yet explored are additional mechanisms that keep people genuinely stuck, how these mechanisms compound and reinforce each other rather than operating independently, and what actually needs to happen, practically and specifically, in order to move through them successfully, rather than remaining stuck indefinitely, understanding everything intellectually while still, somehow, finding yourself unable to fully permanently leave. Let's talk about the fourth mechanism, one that connects directly to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series, but deserves specific naming here: the sunk cost effect. The psychological pull to continue investing in something specifically because you've already invested so much, rather than because continued investment actually makes sense given everything you now understand. This is worth understanding as a well-documented universal feature of human decision-making, not something unique to narcissistic relationships, but one that operates with particular intensity in this specific context, precisely because the investment involved tends to be so considerable. Years of your life, enormous emotional labor, sometimes shared finances, sometimes children, sometimes an entire social world built around this relationship's continuation. Here's what's worth understanding about why this mechanism specifically makes leaving feel almost unbearable, even once genuine understanding has developed. The more you've invested, the more leaving seems to confirm that the investment was wasted, a conclusion most people work hard, often unconsciously, to avoid reaching. This produces a genuinely counterintuitive effect worth naming directly. The longer and more difficult a relationship has been, the harder it often becomes to leave, precisely because leaving requires accepting that considerable time and effort were spent on something that ultimately couldn't be salvaged, a conclusion that feels, to the sunk cost-influenced mind, considerably more painful than simply continuing to invest, hoping that enough additional effort might eventually justify everything already spent. Let's talk about the fifth mechanism, one that deserves particularly honest examination because it's rarely discussed with enough directness: genuine fear of what comes next, separate from fear of the narcissist's reaction to leaving. This is worth distinguishing carefully from the more commonly discussed fear of confrontation or fear of their anger, because what we're describing here is considerably more existential: a genuine uncertainty about whether life without this relationship will actually be better or whether it will simply be different, potentially lonelier, potentially harder in ways that feel less familiar but no less difficult to navigate. Here's what's worth understanding about why this fear deserves genuine, honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how difficult these relationships make it to trust your own judgment, your own capacity to build something better, your own belief in what's actually possible for your future. If years of erosion have genuinely damaged your confidence in your own ability to create a fulfilling life independently, the fear that leaving might simply trade one kind of difficulty for another isn't irrational. It's a genuine, if often inaccurate, extension of exactly the self-doubt this entire series has traced as one of the deepest wounds these relationships tend to produce. Let's talk about how these five mechanisms — conditioned nervous system attachment, physiological withdrawal, identity entanglement, sunk cost effects, and genuine fear about an uncertain future — actually work together rather than operating as separate, isolated obstacles. This is worth understanding precisely because their combination is what produces the specific, genuinely difficult experience of feeling stuck despite considerable intellectual understanding, and recognizing how they reinforce each other explains why addressing only one of them, understanding the psychology intellectually, for instance, without addressing the physiological and identity-based dimensions, so often fails to produce the actual movement toward leaving that understanding alone would seem like it should produce. Here's what this compounding actually looks like in practice. Conditioned attachment produces the initial pull to stay or return. Physiological withdrawal makes any attempt to leave feel genuinely uncomfortable. reinforcing the conditioned pull with actual physical distress. Identity entanglement makes leaving feel like losing yourself, not just losing them, adding existential weight to what might otherwise be a more manageable decision. Sunk cost thinking makes the accumulated time and effort already invested feel like evidence that leaving would be wasteful, adding a rationalized justification for staying. And genuine fear about an uncertain future removes the confident belief that leaving will actually lead somewhere better, undermining the motivation that might otherwise be strong enough to push through everything else. This is worth understanding as the actual complete answer to this exploration's title, Why You Stay Stuck Despite Understanding Everything You Now Understand. It was never simply a matter of insufficient knowledge, and it was never evidence of weakness or personal failing. It's the predictable, well-documented result of 5 distinct, mutually reinforcing psychological mechanisms, each one genuinely powerful on its own, considerably more powerful when operating together, none of which respond reliably to intellectual understanding alone, however sophisticated and accurate that understanding actually is. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what actually needs to happen, practically and specifically, in order to move through these 5 mechanisms successfully. Why addressing them requires considerably more than simply continuing to accumulate psychological knowledge, and what genuine, sustainable movement toward leaving actually requires from each of these 5 specific dimensions. Let's talk about what actually needs to happen practically and specifically in order to move through each of these 5 mechanisms. Because understanding them clearly, as we've done throughout this exploration, is only useful if it translates into a genuine, actionable path forward, one considerably more comprehensive than simply continuing to accumulate more psychological knowledge, which, as we established in Part 2, was never actually the missing ingredient in the first place. Here's what addressing conditioned nervous system attachment actually requires: repeated, deliberate exposure to genuine distance, sustained long enough for the conditioning itself to weaken through simple lack of reinforcement. This is worth understanding as a genuinely physiological process, not simply a matter of willpower, which means expecting instant relief from a single attempt at distance sets you up for unnecessary discouragement. Each period of genuine separation, even if it eventually ends in return, weakens the conditioning somewhat, the same way each failed attempt at quitting a genuinely addictive substance still contributes cumulative progress toward eventual success, even though any single attempt might not be the one that finally holds permanently. Here's what addressing physiological withdrawal actually requires: understanding it as a temporary, predictable process with a genuine, if uncomfortable, timeline, considerably more like recovering from any other form of withdrawal, requiring patience, self-compassion, and practical strategies for managing acute discomfort, rather than treating it as evidence that leaving was somehow the wrong decision. This might involve deliberately building structure into the early days and weeks after leaving, ensuring your time and attention have somewhere concrete to go, precisely because unstructured time tends to make withdrawal considerably harder to move through than time filled with genuine, if initially effortful, alternative engagement. Here's what addressing identity entanglement actually requires: connecting directly to something we traced extensively in an earlier exploration throughout this series. Deliberately, gradually building sources of identity and meaning entirely separate from the relationship, ideally beginning before leaving becomes final, so that leaving doesn't require constructing an entirely new sense of self from nothing, but rather stepping more fully into identity foundations that have already begun, even in small ways, to take root independently. This work is slow, and it's worth understanding that it doesn't need to be complete before leaving becomes possible, but even modest progress in this area considerably reduces the disorientation that identity entanglement otherwise produces. Here's what addressing sunk cost thinking actually requires: a genuine, deliberate reframe, understanding that the actual waste isn't the time already invested, which cannot be recovered regardless of what happens next, but rather any additional time invested going forward in a pattern that has already demonstrated, reliably, that it doesn't produce what you actually need. This reframe is worth practicing directly and repeatedly because sunk cost thinking tends to resurface persistently, requiring genuine ongoing correction rather than a single moment of realization that permanently resolves it. Here's what addressing genuine fear about an uncertain future actually requires: deliberately, incrementally building evidence that contradicts the fear rather than waiting for the fear to disappear before taking any action at all. This might mean starting extremely small, making a single independent decision and noticing that you survived it, rebuilding a single friendship and noticing genuine connection developing, taking a single step toward a goal entirely your own and noticing genuine satisfaction in the effort itself. Each small piece of contradicting evidence, accumulated deliberately over time, gradually weakens the fear's grip, considerably more effectively than trying to reason your way out of it through logic alone. Let's talk about the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that ties together not just this specific video, but so much of what this entire series has been building toward throughout its full length. Being stuck was never actually about insufficient understanding, and moving forward was never actually going to happen simply by accumulating more of it. Genuine movement requires addressing all 5 dimensions we've traced today, simultaneously and specifically: nervous system conditioning, physiological withdrawal, identity, sunk cost thinking, and fear about the future, because understanding alone, however sophisticated, only ever addressed one small piece of what was actually keeping you stuck. So if you've spent considerable time understanding narcissistic psychology with genuine sophistication, able to explain every mechanism this entire series has traced with real fluency, while still finding yourself stuck, unable to fully, permanently move forward, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series. You were never failing to understand something important. You were missing a comprehensive approach, one that addresses your nervous system alongside your intellect, your identity alongside your knowledge, your fear alongside your understanding. This comprehensive work is harder than simply learning more, and it takes considerably longer than any single moment of realization could ever provide. But it's genuinely, entirely available to you, one deliberate step at a time across all 5 dimensions simultaneously, until the day arrives when staying stuck finally, permanently, becomes something your entire self, not just your intellect, no longer requires. Let's go further into something worth naming directly because it deserves genuine space, what it actually looks like when these 5 mechanisms are being addressed simultaneously in real lived practice, rather than as 5 separate items on a checklist worked through one at a time in isolation. This matters because approaching them sequentially, fully resolving one before moving to the next, isn't actually how this work tends to unfold in reality, and expecting that kind of clean sequence can create unnecessary discouragement when progress feels messier and more overlapping than any tidy 5-step plan would suggest. Here's what integrated progress often actually looks like. On a given week, you might notice the conditioned pull resurface strongly, perhaps triggered by an unexpected memory or an old photo, while simultaneously noticing genuine, if modest, progress in identity building, a new interest that's beginning to feel less like effortful distraction and more like authentic engagement. These 2 things can be happening at once, seemingly contradicting each other. The pull still present while genuine growth is also simultaneously underway. This isn't a sign that the growth isn't real, or that the pull will never fade. It's simply what nonlinear healing across 5 interconnected dimensions genuinely looks like, messier and less satisfying to track than a clean upward trajectory, but no less real for its messiness. Let's talk about something worth naming honestly here, because it addresses a specific frustration many people experience during this process. The sense that progress in one dimension should logically produce corresponding progress in the others, and confusion or discouragement when this expected transfer doesn't actually occur. You might, for instance, make genuine progress in weakening sunk cost thinking, arriving at real clarity that continuing to invest doesn't make sense, while still experiencing genuine physiological withdrawal that makes acting on that clarity considerably harder than the clarity itself would suggest. This gap between intellectual and emotional readiness is worth understanding as entirely normal, not evidence that your clarity wasn't genuine, simply evidence that these 5 dimensions, while connected, don't automatically resolve each other through simple proximity. Let's close with something important worth carrying forward from this edition specifically, because it ties directly into the practical, comprehensive approach this exploration has described throughout. Patience with this non-linear, overlapping process isn't simply a nice sentiment offered to make the work feel gentler. It's actually strategically important, because impatience with the mess of simultaneous, uneven progress across 5 dimensions tends to produce exactly the kind of discouragement that pushes people back toward the conditioned pull we discussed at the very beginning of this exploration. The same pull that becomes considerably stronger whenever genuine progress starts to feel too slow, too effortful, or too disappointingly inconsistent to seem worth continuing. This is worth understanding as the final, practical piece of everything this exploration has traced. Expect unevenness. Expect overlap. Expect moments where different dimensions seem to contradict each other, and treat all of this as the genuine, lived texture of comprehensive healing rather than evidence that something is going wrong. The version of you working through all 5 of these dimensions simultaneously, imperfectly, unevenly, but genuinely, is already doing something considerably more difficult and considerably more valuable than simply understanding the psychology intellectually ever could have accomplished on its own.